My son opened the front door of his Halifax house, looked at the rain on my jacket and the box in my hands, and said, "Dad, this isn't a great time." It was the third Saturday of November. I had driven 2 hours down the 103 to deliver something I'd been carrying around for 11 months, waiting for the right moment. Behind him I could hear music from the kitchen, voices, the particular sound of a dinner party in a warm house. My granddaughter Margot came to the top of the stairs and looked down at me through the railing. She's 13. She has her grandmother's eyes and the same way of going very still when she's paying close attention. Then Bradley Forsyth appeared over Joel's shoulder, Vanessa's father, up from Oakville for the weekend. He put a hand on the door frame and looked at me the way you look at something that shows up at the wrong time. And he said, "Warren, Joel mentioned you've been having a hard go of it since Iris. We all understand. Why don't you give these guys a week or two and they'll come out to see you?" We all understand. I stood on that step in the November rain holding a cedar box, and I thought about the 41 years I had spent building houses with my hands, and I thought about the building in Dartmouth, and I thought about the number that my accountant had put on one sheet of paper 2 weeks earlier, and I did not say any of it. I said, "Of course, you're right." I set the box down just inside the door and I walked back to my truck. "My name is Warren Drummond. I'm 63 years old. I build houses. Or I did for 38 years, until my knees and my wife's cancer arrived in the same autumn, which was 3 years ago now, and I retired one and couldn't retire the other. I'm based out of Chester, on the south shore of Nova Scotia, about an hour southwest of Halifax. The kind of place where 3 generations of the same family have been getting their boats out of the water at the same municipal wharf for 100 years. I've been here since 1987. Let me tell you what I look like, because it matters to this story. My hands are wrecked. 38 years of framing and finish work, and they show it. The joints are enlarged. One finger on the right hand won't straighten fully since a table saw incident in 2003 that I'm not going to go into detail about. And there is a permanent line of something under my fingernails that isn't dirt but looks like it is. It's old stain. Walnut, mostly. It doesn't come out anymore, and I've stopped trying. I drive a 2009 F-250 with 340,000 kilometers on it and a crack in the windshield I've been meaning to get fixed since 2021. I smell like sawdust and linseed oil and something underneath that I can't identify anymore because I've been breathing it for so long it doesn't register. My son can smell it. He told me once, politely, at a restaurant in Halifax, that he'd noticed my jacket. That was all. "Dad, is that the only jacket?" I said yes. We had lunch and it was fine. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. Iris and I were married for 37 years. She ran the books, handled every client invoice, every subtrade payment, every HST remittance, every argument with the BDC about our line of credit in 2009 when things went sideways. She was better at the business than I was, and she knew it and never once said so in a way that made it a problem. She died 26 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 9 weeks from diagnosis to the end. And if you've lost someone to it, you already know there's nothing to say about that timeline except that it isn't enough. She died at home, in our bedroom, on a Tuesday morning in September, and the trees outside the window had just started to turn. I have 2 kids, Bonnie, who's 40 and teaches high school English in Fredericton, and Joel, who's 37 and lives in Halifax and runs a design consultancy called Meridian Studio. Bonnie's the stubborn one. Joel was the easy one when he was young, and that matters. I want to say it plainly because I'm going to say some hard things about my son, and I don't want to pretend he started out as someone who'd do what he eventually did. He didn't. He started out as a boy who used to sit on an upturned milk crate in the corner of whatever house I was framing and watch me work. Not asking questions. Just watching. He had this quality of total attention that his mother had too, and I was proud of it. I know the moment things started to shift and it was nobody's fault, not really. Or it was mine, and that amounts to the same thing. Joel was about 16, and I had a contract building a spec house for a developer out of Dartmouth named Bernard Colquhoun, who was the kind of man who wore new clothes to job sites. He came out on a Thursday to walk the framing with me, stood in the shell of the second floor, and told me he was cutting the millwork budget by 30%, and that if I couldn't work with that number, he had another builder who could. I said all right. Because it was February, I had 2 other guys on site. The mortgage was $5,000 a month, and Bernard Colquhoun knew exactly what he was doing when he came on a Thursday in February. Joel was there that day. He'd come directly from school on the bus. He was standing in the rough opening for a window, and I saw his face when I said all right. He didn't say anything. He never brought it up. But I think about that moment more than almost any other in 38 years of working. He went to architecture school at Dalhousie and stayed in Halifax and built Meridian Studio over about 12 years. They do high-end residential renovations and some commercial interior work. Heritage properties mostly, old Victorian houses in the North End, restaurant fit-outs in buildings with exposed brick and original plank floors. He is genuinely excellent at it. His eye is better than mine ever was, and I've told him so. Here's the part that needs explaining. In 2015, Joel's studio was struggling. He'd taken on a project that had gone over budget, lost a key draftsman, and his line of credit was nearly maxed. He came out to Chester on a Sunday in March and sat at our kitchen table, and I let him talk for a while before I asked him the actual number. Iris wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt, which is what she always did. And then she did the thing that I believe was the right instinct and the wrong decision. And I want to be clear about the difference, because I've spent 2 years thinking about it. She didn't give him money. She said, "What about the Dartmouth space?" She meant a building I'd bought the year before, a 1920s brick warehouse in the Woodside area of Dartmouth, just across the Mackay Bridge from Halifax. I'd bought it in 2014 for $395,000 when the neighborhood was rough and industrial, and the closest coffee shop was a 15-minute drive. The building had good bones. It always had good bones. And the whole eastern flank of Dartmouth was going to come back eventually, because Halifax was full and Dartmouth was across a bridge, and young people would eventually run the numbers. Iris saw it before I finished buying it. We set up a numbered company, 1147 Drummond Holdings Inc., and leased the second floor to Meridian Studio at what was, in 2015, roughly market rate for that area, $2,800 a month, and then we never raised it. I want you to understand what happened to that part of Dartmouth over the following 9 years, because it's the whole story in miniature. The vacant lot next door became a microbrewery. The transmission shop across the street became a ceramics studio and then an architecture firm. A restaurant went in on the ground floor of our building. The whole neighborhood filled in fast, and by 2023 the going rate for that kind of commercial space was somewhere between $6,500 and $8,000 a month, depending on who you asked. Joel was paying $2,800, 9 years. Never a missed payment to his credit, never a late one. But the number I sat with when my accountant pulled the comparison was just over $480,000. That is how much below market the rent had accumulated to over 9 years. $480,000 quietly handed to a man who told his in-laws, at Christmas dinner, that his father was relying on the kids more than he lets on. I wasn't there for that Christmas dinner. Bonnie called me the next day and told me what he'd said. She asked if I wanted her to say something to him. I said no. Here's what Iris said in our kitchen in 2015, and I've turned it over so many times the edges are worn smooth. She said, "Warren, if we tell him, he'll never believe he built it. Give him that. Just give him that." She was trying to protect his confidence. She loved him and she understood that a man who's been given something believes, somewhere underneath, that he can be ungiven it. She wanted him to think he'd earned it. And I went along with it because Iris was usually right, and because it was easier, and because I told myself it was generosity. Standing on the other side of all this, I think it was a mistake. A kind mistake. But ours. And I'll say more about that at the end, because I think some of you are making some version of it right now. After Iris died, the first 2 months were fine. Joel came down 3 weekends running. He fixed the gate on the tool shed badly and I let him. He sat with me in the evenings and we watched hockey and didn't talk much, and it was, honestly, what I needed. Then it started. And it starts so small you'd feel foolish pointing at it. 3 months after the funeral, "Dad, have you thought about the long-term plan out there?" 4 months. "Dad, that roof's going to need work in a couple of years. Have you talked to anyone?" 6 months. "I can't restructure our whole schedule around you being isolated down there. You know that, right?" I had not asked him for a single thing, not one call to say I was struggling. I came to Halifax 3 times that year, always to see Margot and Finn, always under 3 hours, always with something in the truck. A cord of split birch, a case of preserves Iris had made before she got sick, a lamp I'd refinished that I thought Margot would like for her room. Every single time I left before dinner. But Joel had built a version of me, and once you build a version of somebody, everything they do confirms it. There is no move you can make against a version of yourself that someone else has already decided on. You just have to live in it and let them narrate. I first understood how far it had gone at Finn's birthday party last summer. I was upstairs using the washroom, and when I came out to the landing I could hear Joel on the back deck below. He was talking to someone I didn't know, and he was saying, honestly, so between the property and just keeping him from rattling around down there by himself, it's a lot. It's a genuine lot. He said it with the particular weariness of a man doing something admirable and not wanting to make it about himself. I stood at the top of those stairs for about 30 seconds, and I want to be honest about this because I think it matters. My first feeling was not anger. It was a specific embarrassment, the kind where some part of you wonders, for 4 seconds, whether the version someone else is telling about you might be more accurate than the one you tell yourself. 4 seconds of that. Then I remembered the building, and the grocery receipt, and the number on one sheet of paper. I went downstairs and said nothing. That was my half of this. I want you to know that. The week after Finn's birthday, Bonnie called. She'd had dinner with Joel in Halifax, and she told me, without softening, because that's how Bonnie works, that Joel had mentioned the Dartmouth property in conversation, to Vanessa, in front of her. He'd said that when the time came to deal with the estate side of things, the building was the main asset, and it might make sense to consolidate. I called Catherine Marsh, who's been my lawyer in Chester for 20 years, and told her what Joel had said. 2 weeks later, Catherine came back with something that changed the temperature of everything. Joel had called a Halifax commercial real estate firm asking for a market valuation of the Dartmouth building, listed as a client inquiry. He had not told me, he had not asked, he'd just pulled the thread to see what was on the other end. Catherine said, "Warren, do you want my opinion or do you want me to get ahead of it?" I said, "Get ahead of it." Then I said, "What's your opinion?" She said, "He's doing his own math." I said I knew. She asked if she should send the non-renewal. I said not yet. That's where things stood in November. That's what was in the cedar box I drove 2 hours to deliver. Not money, not a request. A folder on top and something beneath it that was never about any of this. I came to Halifax on that third Saturday because I'd been carrying Iris's renovation journal for 11 months, and I wanted to give it to my son. I never got the first sentence out, so I set the box inside the door, and I drove home in the rain. When I got back to Chester, I went out to the workshop and I sanded a piece of white oak for an hour and a half in the dark with one light on, because that's what I do when I'm sorting something out. I don't need to understand the wood, I just need my hands doing something clean and correct. Here's the one thing I want to teach you about building, and I won't mention it again, but everything from here runs on it. When you're framing a house, there's a mistake that inexperienced builders make. They look at a wall and they think, this wall carries nothing. No visible function, nothing special. So they take it down, and for 6 months everything looks fine. The ceiling holds, the floor holds, nothing shifts. Then one winter, the freeze-thaw cycle does its work and the load the building has been redistributing starts to show. A crack above a window, a door that won't latch, a floor with a sag you can only feel in your socks at night. A wall doesn't have to look structural to be structural. You find out what it's carrying by looking at what's above it, not at the wall itself. I have said that to Joel since he was 12 years old. He wrote it in a notebook once. He quoted it back to me at a client dinner once. It had reached his hand without ever reaching his gut. 3 days after the Halifax trip, Bonnie called again, without any softening this time. She said, "Joel called me. He wants to know if I'd co-sign something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "He wants an assessment from a geriatric care consultant." He used the phrase cognitive evaluation. He said you've been making decisions about the Dartmouth property that don't align with the estate planning he thought was in place, and he's concerned that since Iris, she stopped. Then she said, "Dad, I told him no, and I told him why in terms that I think he understood clearly." I was standing in my kitchen. The same kitchen where Iris wrote a number on the back of a grocery receipt 9 years ago. What actually happened in me is hard to describe. Not rage, something colder. The calm that comes at -20 when the job has to happen anyway and you don't have time to think about the cold. You just do the next correct thing and then the next until the engine turns over. Because here is the difference, and this is the hinge of the whole story. Up until that phone call, I thought my son was scared. He'd lost his mother. He was looking at his father and seeing age and solitude, and all the things that frightened him about his own future, and he was trying to manage it the only way he knew how. Scared people do things that look like cruelty. You can come back from scared. I was willing to wait it out. But a man who calls his sister to arrange a cognitive assessment is not scared anymore. He's planning. He sat down and looked at his available options. Tell his wife the full truth about the building, or pursue legal grounds to manage his father's affairs. And he thought about which one made more sense. That's not grief wearing a hard face. That's a conclusion he'd been building toward for 2 years and had finally decided to act on. I called Catherine Marsh the next morning. I said, "Send the non-renewal." She went quiet for a moment, then said, "Warren, if I send this, the market rate kicks in at the next quarter. He won't be able to absorb it right away." I said, Catherine, he hasn't been absorbing anything. He just doesn't know it yet. She sent it. Now, the last Saturday of November, I called Joel and Vanessa, Bonnie and her husband Peter, my neighbor Glenn Acker, who's known our family 30 years, and the kids Margot and Finn. I told them it was a late-season dinner at the house in Chester, which was true. We do one every year. Iris started it. I said I wanted to see everyone before the Christmas season got complicated. Joel came because he thought I was going to walk it back. I know this because Vanessa told me afterward. He told her in the car coming down the 103, he's going to back down. He hates a scene. 38 years, and that is what my son had on me. My workshop is out behind the house, a cedar-clad building 40 feet long that I built in 1994 and put a proper heating system into in 2012. There's a workbench the full length of one wall, a bandsaw, a planer, a dust collector I've had since before Joel was born. The smell in there in November is raw wood and machine oil, and underneath it the beeswax I use on the chisels. There is no better smell on earth. I've tried to explain it to people who haven't been in a wood shop and I can never get it right. You have to breathe it. I was at the bench when they came through the side door. All of them. Joel in a jacket that had never seen a cold morning. Bradley Forsyth in a sweater that probably cost more than my planer. Vanessa in good boots, the right kind, which I appreciated. Margot went straight to the wall of hand planes because Margot always goes straight to the hand planes. Finn touched everything, which is correct at 10. I let them stand there for about a minute and a half while I finished the pass I was making. A minute and a half is a long time in a room full of people who don't know what to do with their hands. Then I set the plane down, walked to the bench stool and sat on it. I said, thanks for coming out. Joel said, Dad. There was something in his voice already, relief, maybe. Like he thought we were back on familiar ground. I said, I'm going to say this once, all the way through. Then anyone who wants to say something can say it. And I told them. Standing in my workshops with sawdust on my sleeves, I told them about March of 2015 and Iris's grocery receipt. I told them the Dartmouth address. I told them 1147 Drummond Holdings. I told them 9 years and the rent that never moved and the number. $480,000 in below-market rent absorbed over those 9 years. I watched that number go around the room like a dropped wrench. Bradley Forsyth's face was the one I'll remember longest. I'm not going to be gracious about that. I was watching for it, and I saw it. And something in me was satisfied, and I'm not proud of that, but it's true. Vanessa's face was something else entirely. Not shock, but the particular expression of a person realigning several things simultaneously. Then I told them what Iris said. Give him that. Just give him that. And I said that was her call, and I went along with it, and I've come to think we were both wrong. We gave a man a building and let him believe he'd built it himself, and then wondered why he lost that ability to see what was actually holding him up. That's on us. That's mine to carry too. Joel had been staring at the workbench. He looked up then, he said quietly, You've been managing me for 9 years. I said yes, and we were wrong to do it the way we did it. That stopped him. He didn't have a response prepared for agreement. I said, 3 weeks ago I came to your house in Halifax with something I'd been waiting to give you for nearly a year. I wanted 15 minutes alone with you to tell you all of this before I handed it over. You sent me away at the door in front of your father-in-law and my granddaughter. He didn't say anything. I said, You didn't come out here when I asked. Do you want to tell everyone what you did instead, or should I? Bonnie said, from the corner by the planer, I'll say it. Joel said her once, quietly. Bonnie said, He called me and asked me to co-sign a cognitive assessment for Dad. He said Dad was making financial decisions that didn't line up with estate planning, and he was concerned the grief had affected his judgment. The workshop went very quiet in the specific way that only happens when a lot of people are breathing in the same space, and nobody is speaking. Vanessa turned and looked at her husband. I won't over-describe that look, but it was the look of a person running 9 years of information through a new calculation and getting a different answer than she expected. Bradley Forsyth said Joel's name just the once. And my son stood in my workshop in that clean jacket with his hands at his sides and did not answer. Then I looked at Joel. And I want to tell you what I actually saw, because it would be easy to make him a villain, and he isn't one. I saw a 16-year-old boy standing in a window frame in a half-built house, watching a developer from Dartmouth take 30% off my invoice with polite precision, and deciding in that moment that he would be anything on earth before he'd be the man in the work boots saying all right. He wasn't wrong that the world does that. The world absolutely does that. It had done it to my father, and it had done it to me, and Grady saw it and it burned him clean through. The problem is he built a version of himself out of appearances rather than substance, and once appearances are the whole structure, anything that threatens the appearance threatens the life. Including a father in a stained jacket on a doorstep. That's not evil. It's a category error made at 16 and never corrected. He decided that because I chose to look like the kind of man who takes a bad number quietly, I was that man, and everything I did afterward he filed under that conclusion. That's not cruelty. That's worse. It's management. I said, the non-renewal went out last month. The lease converts to market rate at the next quarter. I'm not taking Meridian. I don't want your company. I own a building and I've stopped subsidizing the space. That's the whole of what's happened. Joel said, you're dismantling everything I built. I said, and I'd had 3 weeks to get this sentence right, so I'll give it to you exactly. Son, if my signature was the thing carrying the load, the wall was never decorative. You just never looked at what was above it. He came at that, not physically. His voice went up and he said, I worked for 12 years. I said, I know you did, and most of it was real. That's what makes this worth having the conversation. He said, you controlled everything and I didn't even know it. I said, that's fair. That's actually fair, Joel. You didn't consent to any of it. Your mother and I decided what was good for you and did it behind your back for 9 years and you never had a say. That is a real grievance and you can hold it as long as you need to. Then I said, and it doesn't reach the phone call you made to your sister. He had nothing left after that. Here's the moment I want you to have. Margot had been standing by the hand planes the whole time. 13 years old, she heard all of it. And when it was over and everyone was standing in my workshop, not knowing where to look, she walked the full length of that building, past her father, and came and stood next to me at the bench. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on the end of the vise, the way she does when she's watching me work, and she stood there. That is the correction. That is a 13-year-old figuring something out on her own, and then acting on it in a room full of adults. It undid me more than anything else in the previous month. Because 2 weeks earlier on a step in Halifax, she had watched me get sent away and looked down at the floor because looking up felt too complicated. This was her revising that decision, in front of everyone, without being asked. I'm going to tell you what happened after, plainly, without making it into something it isn't. Meridian Studio is still operating. Joel moved out of the Dartmouth building in January into a smaller space in Halifax's north end, 600 square feet with a shared boardroom and bad parking. He let one employee go, which I know cost him something real because the man had been with him 7 years. The work continues. It's smaller, and it's actually his now in a way it wasn't before, and I think on some level he knows the difference even if he hasn't said so. Vanessa stayed. She told me in February on the phone, I'm not leaving over the money, I'm staying to see what he does with it. That is the most clear-eyed thing I've heard anyone say about a marriage in a long time, and I have a great deal of respect for it. Bradley Forsyth left a voicemail in December. I've listened to it. I haven't called back yet. Joel came out to Chester in April, on a Sunday morning alone, driving a borrowed truck because he'd sold the car. He stood in the driveway in an old shirt, with a small hole at the collar, and he said, Can I help you with anything today? Not can I come in, not can we talk, can I help? I want to be honest about the next 4 seconds. I stood in my own driveway and I thought about saying no. I considered at 63 years old telling my son to turn around and drive back up the highway. I'm not proud of those seconds, but I'm glad I'm aware of them, because it means what I said next was a real decision. I said, there's a cabinet frame in the shop that needs a second pair of hands for the glue up. We worked about 3 hours. He's better with his hands than he thinks. He always was. At some point, without planning it, he said, the worst part is I don't know how much of what I built was actually mine. He was holding a corner while I ran the clamps. I said, that's the question you find out the answer to by doing the next 10 years. He nodded. We didn't say much else. At the truck before he left, he said, Dad, that night in November, the cedar box. He meant the one I'd set inside his Halifax door and taken back on my way out of town. He'd never opened it. He still hasn't in the workshop. I said, come out again and I'll show you. He said, what's in it? I said, your mother. What's in the box is Iris's renovation journal. 38 years of houses, 1 entry per project, her handwriting in blue rollerball. Every house we built together, every client, every problem we solved or failed to solve. On the last page she had drawn, because she drew everything, site plans, furniture layouts, ideas she had in the middle of the night, she had drawn the floor plan of a small studio building. Compact, well-lit, north-facing windows, a proper workspace designed by someone who understood what work actually requires. And she had written Joel's name at the top in her careful hand, and below it, when he's ready to see what's actually there. She drew it 8 months before she died. I don't know exactly when she had it in mind. I found it a year after the funeral, going through her desk, and when I found it, I sat in her chair in that cold room for a long time without turning the light on. That is what I drove 2 hours in November rain to give my son. Not a lesson, not a confrontation, not a warning. A room his mother had spent months thinking about, designed for a version of him she believed was still coming. He stood in his doorway and looked at my jacket and my truck and my 63-year-old hands, and he decided he already knew what I was there for. He looked at the wall and assumed it was decorative. He had no idea what it was carrying. I've spent a long time thinking about what I would do differently, and I keep landing in the same place. The kitchen in Chester, March 2015, Iris's voice. Give him that, just give him that. I think the kindest thing I could have done for my son, the thing that would have actually protected him, was to sit across from him that evening and say, we're doing this together, all of it, and here is exactly what that looks like. Not to hand him something invisible and call it confidence. Real confidence doesn't come from not knowing what held you up. It comes from knowing and building anyway. That's the difference, and it was mine to give him, and I didn't. You may be in someone's life right now, carrying something they don't know about, telling yourself it's love. I'm not saying stop carrying. I'm saying don't carry it in silence. Because the day they find out without you there to explain yourself, you become the story they tell, not the one you meant to be. So here's what I'll ask of you, and it costs nothing but about a minute of discomfort. The next time someone says something about you that isn't quite right, small, harmless, the kind you'd normally let go because correcting it feels like making a fuss, don't let it go. Just say, without anger, without heat, that's not quite how it is, and then say what is. That's the whole thing. You don't have to win. You just have to not confirm the wrong version with your silence. Because I let a wrong version of me run for 2 years without correcting it, and by the end my son was on the phone to his sister, using the phrase cognitive evaluation. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read everyone. Last month there was someone in Kamloops writing at midnight from a parking lot, and someone in PEI who said they'd heard their own daughter say something like what Joel said and didn't know what to do next. I wrote back to that one. I'm still thinking about it. Give me a number. Comment 1 if you think I did right sending that non-renewal. No warning, no softening. Let him find the floor and see what he'd actually built. Comment 2 if you think I should have sat down with him and offered a stepped increase over 5 years. Because he's my son and blood earns you at least one more chance before the ground comes out. Or comment 3 if the real mistake was made in a kitchen in Chester in 2015, when Iris said give him that, and everything that followed was just the invoice arriving 9 years late. I've got my own answer. I'm not giving it yet. I want to see where you land first because I've been wrong about my own family before, and I'd rather have the company. The cedar box is still in the shop. The journal's inside it. Joel hasn't been back yet, but he will. Because a man who shows up in a borrowed truck and asks if he can help with the glue-up is a man working his way back toward something, and he just needs to do it at the pace that's actually his. I'll leave the light on in the shop. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental.